Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is last in a group of 6 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 3. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine the whole of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 207 with the fire god's final trick, which at last brings down the tyrant dwarf. Loge's work is almost done, but not quite yet, as Horn's woodwinds answer with a brightly mocking arrogance pulse, concluded without horns by a puckish, unsyncopated major mode ring fragment parody stretched across 2 measures on semiquaver violins, which parse the morpheme's thirds into a series of downward leaps as a reminder of Mima's earlier frustrations. Quaver oboes, clarinets, violas, then clarinets, bassoons, cellos double this fall in unbroken consecutive thirds, together with arrogance as a whole pointing to Alberich's imminent fall as it introduces a quick set of its variants as he floats the idea which finally traps Alberich, that being to prove the Tarnhelm's powers extend to small as well as large. The brief sequence expertly allocates its syntax between orchestra and the fire god's vocal, which begins a cappella on 3 static notes to leap up a 6th. He then falls a 3rd, another ringlust inversion, while low strings march staccato up the 6-note scale, evoking both Mima's vain hopes and his tyrant brother's world aspirations. This distinctive variant is revisited only during this brief passage, yet its plasticity foreshadows the module's diversity as it spreads across the tetralogy. In addition, as it's essentially an inversion of the spear, it also includes a subtle warning to Wotan that his own plans are in equal jeopardy, though one he doesn't notice, never mind heed. Clarinets, high strings cap it with that same ring fragment variant, its harmony shifting to diminished minor while Loge intones chagrin, a module which has played a key role in this battle of wits. Under his vocals falling 3rd, the prideful upward scale again rises rather comically on bassoons, English horns, to be contradicted by that same fragment lampoon, here in strings alone, which rises again in its own opposition, creating a bloated distortion of the embryonic ring. The fire god leaps up a 6th into this module's descending line to fall a tritone, then lift on reverse chord notes, yet another ringlust distortion. With its ascending half he falls a 3rd, then, after a quaver rest, lifts on that interval to create an abandonment triad with its load of betrayal. This triggers his descent on the words Das Klügste scheint mir das, Gefahren schlau zu entfliehen, a long a cappella falling scale contradicted after a single string pizzicato by a rising one. This makes the vocal an extended version of his Scene 2 advice for trapping the dwarf, while also evoking the giant turn. Answering him, the vainglorious scale lifts on pizzicato strings, elongated to more closely approximate its Alberich version. With only 2 punctuating string quavers, the fire god opines Alberich can't manage such a transformation, singing the Welterb triad with its now established history of the dwarf's racial aspirations, then an eerie echo of Freya, whose rescue is the purported goal of this expedition. It's also a recollection of the dwarf's Scene 1 humiliation, the second on Loge's part in only moments, yet another touch calculated to infuriate Alberich. The tyrant sneers back, voice bouncing up then down a 3rd into a static triplet capped by a tritone, all atop 2nd violins, violas, fingering tremolos, while low octavo strings descend a chromatic scale of extended reverse melody notes, their minim crotchet pulse flavored by the spear. First violins oppose them with melody notes proper on a series of trill appoggiaturas, the whole aptly depicting Alberich's dander raised by Loge's offense on Wotan's behalf against both the dwarf's pride and his wounded sexuality. The first violin's final trill appoggiatura having sustained through the entire previous measure, low strings rise with the next on another marcato quaver scale, punched by a violin-viola dotted minim tremolo chord. Leaping up a third at scale's top, Alberich finishes a cappella with the simmering module of his threats against his dwarves, challenging the demigod to name the size he's to take. The ring fragment burlesque answers with a measure of its wonted diminished harmonies, on whose last crotchet Loge specifies, "dass die feinste Klinse dich fass," with a vocal that bounces on thirds, then roughly follows the strings describing reverse melody notes with their own racial overtones. He caps his phrase by falling a stealthily commanding air to fourth, and, in the crotchet pause, two downward viola chord note twitches foreshadow the dwarf's choice. Loge seeds that in his adversary's mind, wo bang die Kröte sich birgt, bouncing up and down on tritones finished with yet another irksome Freya distortion. As intriguingly, cellos slither down chromatically in a pair of reverse melody notes to accompany him, the first set of which violins oppose by harmonizing. For the second, however, seconds follow the cellos, but firsts counter them with melody notes proper. The result for the ear is an extravagantly harmonized chord note opposition, basis of the Tarnhelm's second half. The dwarf tyrant sniffs at the task's ease, a single expletive in his voice, then, after a quaver rest, a threatening Welterb triad, telegraphing the imminent racial change. As first violins descend a fourth in dotted minims over a low string pedal, his vocal bookended by four more viola twitches, the first two on chord notes, the last two dropping in thirds to outline the Welterb triad. Four mystic horns sigh a Tarnhelm abbreviation as he orders his unwanted guests to watch, a static triplet capped with a falling third in his voice. Then, after a breve rest, and very much as he's done twice before, Alberich utters his spell on leaping tonic intervals, a reverse ash interval on a fourth, then, after a crotchet rest, its low version, lifting a fifth to end in a plunging octave. Wagner's deployment of the Tarnhelm syntax is especially revealing at this point. He omits nearly all of its first half, so it begins with the dwarf's curt warning on its first coda alone, that being its melody notes eloquent of Erda. In this way, Wagner throws the morpheme's syntactic weight entirely onto its second half, two oppositions of chord notes with their reversals. These modules are the exact opposite of those in the morpheme's first half, that one which generates the dragon. No analyst identifies a toad morpheme, though Voltsogen senses one may exist. The different nature of these two animals is most exquisitely reproduced in the music. If such transformational powers flow from Erda through Loge into the Tarnhelm, its syntax must reflect that by first generating the dragon, then Alberich's toad, which is exactly what it does. On the horn's final Tarnhelm note, an English horn twice echoes a cell which takes its shape directly from the helm's second half, that being its chord notes together with their reversals. The helm's second half has only just repeated this module a third time, linking it indelibly to the toad morpheme, whose chord note opposition simply inverts the initial three notes of the dragon. This leaves no syntactic doubt that Tarnhelm's two segments contain both the power to increase size and decrease it. The present manipulation of that syntax also throws its chord notes that much more into focus, which the English horn repeats two more times, further divorcing the chord notes from any notion so limited as servitude. Accompanying all this, clarinets fidget little pairs of croaking descents which reveal their immediately prior meaning as they interlace, Loge convincing the dwarf to betray himself in this way. These transformations, meaning Alberich's, Fafner's, and ultimately Siegfried's, can only arise from the natural power of Erda's reverie, which Loge's fires conserve in the Tarnhelm, from which they flow into the matter they change. Neither Alberich nor Wotan are aware of this linkage, even as it winds them ever more tightly in its grasp. Never mind their displays of verve, Alberich brandishing whip ring and Tarnhelm, Wotan fussing and posturing with his spear. Throughout Scene 3 and beyond, these great adversaries remain Loge's puppets at Erda's behest. Wotan may put his foot on Alberich to capture him, but only when Loge urges it. The fire god knows when and how the trap must close, while neither his supposed better nor their mutual dwarfish adversary have an inkling that Loge is master of both, just as Erda has designed and empowered him to be. Calling the god to action atop the last two measures, the fire sprite's voice bounces on thirds, an expression of vitality that's been a habit of all parties during this battle of wits, then ends by plunging an octave. Low marcato strings march decisively up a last quaver scale, recalling its load of vain hopes. This scale continues rising, then slows to dotted minims, rising chromatically on extended melody notes. As violins, violas develop four swift variants of the toad-croak figure, the third turning back on itself and the last forming an up-down natural sign. It's worth noting these two-note modules also echo those which, during Loge's flattery, characterize the ring and ring fragment variants. As they whip themselves into an excited lather here, Alberich voices his distress with three exclamations separated by quaver rests, an upward third, then reverse chord notes, and finally chagrin, its falling interval an octave in pained imitation of Loge. Caroling a strophe halfway between the tattoo and Alberich's taunt over the final violin-viola toad sign, the fire god orders his immortal master to bind the dwarf. Strings unite for an ever stronger pulse of that vainglorious scale, violins, violas, and bowed semiquavers, to peak on the capture's most distinctive syntactic feature. This isn't precisely a morpheme, but certainly a module derived from previous syntax, one that recurs several times after this to recall the dwarf's capture, so asks for a closer look. Launched on plunging octaves that confirm the perfidy of this deed, it proceeds at a rhythmic parallax through chord note iterations. It repeats 4 times in all, and exclusively on strings atop which Loge calls for them to take their game hinauf, his vocal bouncing from static notes up and down on fifths, those intervals mix of the heroic and the tragic, a perfect match for this questionable deed. The following interlude is arguably the most cryptic in the entire tetralogy, so concurrently among its most enlightening. For that reason, I devote nearly an entire video to it alone. My conclusions will likely inspire debate, and I look forward to your comments. I only ask that you strive to keep an open mind, not allow yourselves to be diverted into defending what I feel are the well-meant but inadequate explanations of previous analyses, and work to evaluate this remarkable passage on its own merits. For me, it opened a whole new window onto the epic's far-spanning import. I hope to assist you in enjoying that same benefit. I apologize in advance for not spelling out everything in black and white, but like the interlude itself, my aim is to allow its insights to penetrate gradually and of their own accord in the way Wagner intended them to do. Extant commentary pays the Scene 3-4 interlude uneven attention. Volzogen references its most obvious syntactic elements, Kobe and Hutchison following his lead, while Newman, Spencer Millington, and Sabor offer more detailed motif catalogues. Due to the narrow focus of their studies, Cook and Holman spend no time on it. Donington comments only that We return to the abode of the gods by means of music as graphic as that which brought us down. Outside Sabor, none have anything substantive to say about its import. This is no surprise. Wagner scholars are scrupulously guarded in making claims for strictly musical passages. Sabor's analysis demonstrates that has its drawbacks, particularly as this Scene 3-4 interlude is half again the length of the one linking Scenes 2 and 3, its syntax far more densely constructed. Westernhagen observes, "In spite of its apparent complexity, the section was sketched in a single burst, making it unlikely this is mere padding to accommodate the difficult scene change." Westernhagen goes on to note several morphemes are already found in the compositional sketch, which confirms that they are not decorative afterthoughts as might be supposed, but had a structural function from the first. On that score alone, it's essential to scrutinize this interlude in detail, which holds one of the tetralogy's lingering mysteries. Scene 3 finishes with a rousing development of arrogance, its initial module on horns, woodwinds over trilling, violins, violas, and timpani roll, the composite then repeated an octave higher, with more woodwinds added and first violins racing from their trill up a scale grace as seconds violas complete their own trill appoggiature to join in arrogance's taunting conclusion, horns, woodwinds hammering its air chords. The Loge module then rises chromatically for 2 measures, a subtle reminder of Alberich's taunts, cellos ascending a chromatic quaver scale, the oboe, clarinet, flute, trill appoggiatura supplemented at a measure's delay by piccolo, which races up another scale into a wildly triumphant pair of Loge strophes across most of the orchestra in its original quasi-static form, its first measure in minor mode, the second in jubilant major, Erda's smile, both measures underpinned by a cello trill appoggiatura. This passage matches the stage directions for binding Alberich and hustling him out, and it seems likely Wagner envisioned the current scene being obscured at this point by the scrim he asks to fall, giving the illusion of upward movement. This furious climax merges into a long decrescendo over sinking and attenuating horn woodwind pedal chords, a continuous timpani roll with low-string dotted mid-impulses beneath. The syntactic focus in violins violas consists of ring strophes, 13 back-to-back iterations falling harmonically by intervals of thirds and seconds, their contours altered so as to sharply define the fragment while blurring its ascending notes into scalar twitches, a quaver and 2 semiquavers, then 4 semiquavers alternating with each measure. The quaver-semiquaver ascent takes over permanently on the morpheme's 7th pulse, while on its 9th, low strings lapse an octave lower into a sustained pedal. The final 3-ring iterations flatten to the point their fragments become extended reverse melody notes, their upward twitches Erda melody notes, as if in a turn hinting back at Loge's Scene 2 advice, never mind the giants. The timpani roll falls an octave lower as baleful trombones supersede this ring evolution with a muted resignation strophe, sharp reminder of its contribution to the Scene 2-3 interlude, though here English horn and second bassoon weave melody notes through it. The Nibelung tattoo returns on its heels to pulse nervously through violas into cellos shot through in bass tubas with chord note iterations, Cook's servitude. This droning mix swells then diminishes across 8 measures until anvils hammering the Nibelung tattoo rhythm sweep it and the timpani roll away to by themselves sound another swelling then diminishing 8 measures. It's as if, in their ascent to the surface, gods and dwarf pass more swiftly by subterranean chambers where, unaware of their tyrant's fall, dwarf slaves continue their dogged toil. Alberich's despair at this mortification erupts shockingly on raucous horns, low brass, which almost literally explode from the anvil pulses with Freya's love cell. This morpheme, destined to become the key love syntax of Valkyr, heard so soon after resignation, unmistakably evokes the scene 2-3 interlude in which Cook opines Freya connotes Alberich's bitter resolve to enslave his Nibelung brethren, cemented by his forsworn love. Given his enemies now manhandled vanquished dwarf out of Nibelheim, these morphemes suggest the still harsher truth that his sacrifice has been for nothing. He's forever lost control of his people. What's more, sinking in 4 repetitions, the Freya syntax comes to rest on hugely elongated aorta chords, the anvil tap ceasing, second trombone sinking through reverse melody notes. In this moment of spiritual darkness, the earth goddess herself seems to have dashed the Nibelung's hopes for remaking the world in his own image. Even so, this unique combination of chords and melody notes will soon declare itself again in an even more sinister way, one with its own ghastly kind of hope. The final chord segues from this brooding gloom through a changed common time into the giant thump, which pulses gently on low strings like a ray of light penetrating the obscurity. What those analysts who comment on it take for an evocation of the giants lumbering in the afternoon sun to their rendezvous with the gods. After 2 measures, bassoons rise from the thump in a double iteration of Valhalla Part 1's second half, elongated by first inversion heroic melody notes, their second pulse reinforced by horns to recall arrogance, as it has just closed Scene 3. The syntactic bundle following directly on its heels, however, is paradoxical to say the least. Loge's syntax rising through the string choirs would seem to evoke arrogance, but a closer look reveals this isn't the syntax of that taunting morpheme, but its rising module. That difference isn't so trivial, since the phrase also doesn't tinkle gleefully frozen in place, as in arrogance, or even chromatically, as in its variants, but rather ascends diatonically from the depths, cellos to violas to violins, a weird distortion of Alberich's taunt for Loge, its gentle, even caressing legato having none of the jovial contempt of either. Perhaps more importantly, it isn't formed by chord notes, as in the arrogant syntax, but their reversals, as in the original rising Loge module, with their sense of burgeoning hope. The horn woodwind chording which sustains it is also interesting in that it evokes that moment in Scene 2 when the gods age after Freya is taken from them, here complete with its abandonment triad. More intriguing still, the horn woodwind chording ends by slipping down on reverse melody notes, with a long-short-long pulse as the strings Loge's syntax becomes a series of Alberich's harsh taunt, only to end by describing a rising-falling sign. It's a breathtaking conceptual leap, the embryonic version of new morphemes to foreshadow Valkyr, meaning both fate and magic sleep, and more, looking forward to Götterdämmerung. Rooting this innovation in an audience's mind, the entire complex echoes a second time, harmonically raised to major second, and again prefaced by giant thumps and arrogance. Another equally paradoxical evolution of giant syntax follows directly on its heels. Low strings twice intertwine 2 basic giant thumps with that syntax's distinctive turn, which gains special prominence during Freya's Scene 2 abduction, then echoes in Loge's advice to Wotan, only to reverberate subliminally through Scene 3. Tenor, or so-called Wagner tubas, overlay strings with a pulse of chord notes, a morpheme which analysts recognize as a sign of Nibelung servitude that, along with the previous episode, seems quite out of place amid all this giant syntax. From it, tubas crescendo on extended melody notes, elided to the giant thumps, so that giant module begins on what sounds like a second pulse of chord notes, while as the melody notes rise, low strings expand into 3 repetitions of the giant turn. This complicated bundle repeats, as the previous bundle has just done, though here raised a harmonic fifth, and augmented by bassoons, horns, trombones, and violas to give it the feel of heated emotions on the rise. In answer, cellos and violas combined Loge's ascending reverse chord note module with his chromatic scale in woodwinds as semiquaver triplet violins sweep upwards into the interlude's most fertile yet cryptic measures. Oboes, English horn, clarinets delicately intone the first three notes of Golden Apples, much as they sound when Fafner gloats over the gods losing their goddess of youth, a touch Darcy notices but without further comment. Intertwined with this woodwind fragment, violas softly twist through a pair of distinctive Loge modules, whose final evolution must await Götterdämmerung to reveal itself as predicated by the distinctive first-held note stressed during the fire god's duplicitous comments for Alberich. The Loge syntax continues its evolution in a brief heady progression, one pulse of a unique variant combining Loge's rising and falling air to chord note cells to make them a chord note opposition, as when he first taunts the dwarf. This morphs into a variant of the recent string line, interwoven with that embryonic fate magic sleep syntax. The current passage's descending arpeggio, drawn from Loge's earlier taunts for Alberich. It's also a ring fragment, its rising half that morpheme's inversion. Yet, all this is presented in an amicably loquacious manner quite untypical of the fire god's music today, much less his early twitting of Alberich. Added to the mystery atop the string line, English horn, clarinets twice sound three chords with the giant thump rhythm, in this case making them reverse ash intervals which embrace air to chords while again evoking Fafner's scene to gloat over the gods aging without Freya. As a final conundrum, the entire sequence's mood is almost lighthearted, reassuring, even optimistic, while the directly preceding syntax is either mysterious or flatly dark and foreboding. Driven by a timpani roll crescendo, horns sink on iterations of the first apple notes, 6 times in all, progressively augmented by woodwinds over a bass clarinet pedal, joined in its last 2 measures by bass trombone, a sorrowful minor mode lament growing ever more despairing as the climax approaches. With these apple pulses, strings trace a series of that new minted Loge figure, in yet another variant, their configuration apparently shifted back to his reverse chord note ascent, but which in fact hints at the giant's rising arpeggio. This kaleidoscopic amalgam lifts to a high point when massed strings, brass timpani, and woodwinds cry out a unique evolution of the apple syntax. The first cell of apples sounds twice in its wonted form, its minor mode and orchestration giving it the feel of an agonized scream. Meanwhile, the rising Loge variant rises in first violins, violas simultaneously with second violins, cellos, intoning a more recognizable version, if doubled in length, of the giant's arpeggio. Reinforced by low brass woodwinds, the climactic apple strophe, the harrowing last word in this unusual evolution, is all but identical to Twilight, as it sounds both in Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, supported in the low instruments by air to chords. In the next measure, a shift to triple time propels woodwinds into trading air to chords with strings over a soft horn timpani pedal, 4 alternating and echoing pulses in all that rise in scalar major harmony, until the string choir takes over entirely for another 4 strophes, complicated by 7th harmonies, to then rise on 6 additional iterations in double time crotchets. At their crest, Loge's air to chord note cell clatters merrily down for 2 measures on high woodwinds over an augmented brass low woodwind timpani pedal, sustained as the module passes to violins, which extend it for another 2 measures, then pass it to bassoons, violas, cellos for a last 2-measure pulse. The orchestra's low-register pedal disappears as bassoons, bass clarinet, cello saw away for 2 measures of tremolos, then rush up for another 2 of Loge's scale. Abruptly shifting from triple to common time, horns add to the stings beginning each measure as the entire string choir shouts 6 air-to-chord iterations, each with a rhythmic offset identical to those which close scene 3. The last two rise a half step, then, after an ever more powerful sting, descend chromatically on 3 more chords to end with a final horn-punctuated sting, answered by one on strings alone, graced by swift opposing scales. In this way, Scene 4 begins. Faced with the Scene 3-4 interlude syntactic minefield, the judicious majority view is best summed up by Donington's observation, as previously quoted. This is traveling music, nothing more. Sabor, who treads its risky syntactic territory more thoroughly than do his colleagues, gives a brief nod to Alberich's sorrow during the interlude's earlier portion, then reads what follows as a palimpsest for Wotan's mental state during his trip back to the heights. Sabor bases his interpretation on the prior narrative context, always the best way. While I follow that lead, taking its syntax into thorough account while broadening the prior contexts results in quite different conclusions. Sabor notes the sequence's giant Loge and apple morphemes with little comment, and is naturally unaware of its errata components. His conclusions are persuasive, but feel superficial beside the interlude's length and complexity, a passage which can be read to more completely account for its wealth of syntactic evolutions, particularly as viewed through a much broader lens, one that looks at everything to follow, meaning even beyond Rheingold. Until giant morphemes enter the mix, it seems correct to read the interlude as focused on the gods and their hostage traveling up through Nibelheim. But, pace his critics, Wagner never wastes time on mere pictorialism, and this is the last extended symphonic episode to grace the ring before Valkyr's prelude, thus establishing terms for the approaching Rheingold climax, an eventful finale, which itself paves the way for the epic to come. More has to be afoot in this music than mere touring, never mind Wotan's internal psychology. The first sign of this is in its chain of 13 ring iterations, every one of which minimizes the syntax's last rising notes while emphasizing its initial half, meaning its ring fragments, which, thanks to earlier developments, imply a dramatic racial sociological change in the dwarves. While this bundle of ring pulses certainly telegraphs the god's delight in having snared his prize, by primally stressing its ring fragments, it carries a darker message. Yet another racial shift takes place here. Alberich's loss of control over his Nibelung folk leaves room for Wotan's budding plans for racial domination, a scheme that hasn't really begun to solidify in his mind before this Nibelheim expedition. What the immortal witnesses in the underworld bubbles up through ideas first suggested by Loge when, in Scene 2, he outlines the dwarf's triumphant magic. That morpheme fragment percolates in Wotan's mind throughout Scene 3. If tied to the ring, it's destined to have legs of its own. The resignation pulse, which concludes the fragment development, is certainly a mark of Alberich's despair over his ruined dream for a new race to subjugate the world under his ring-based command, while the horrifically bitter repetitions of Freya fill out that anguish with the knowledge his renunciation of love has been futile. Yet there's more. If taken as merely scene painting, the extended Nibelung tattoo development in both orchestra and anvils seems a longueur. But, particularly in light of the prior ring fragment episode, redolent of racial change, the anvil passage carries a subtle warning for Wotan, which he must heed. Even with their tyrant in fetters, Alberich's slaves hammer on, a dread force even without their tyrannical ruler. Overcoming creatures of such resilient determination won't be so easy as duping their vainglorious general. Meanwhile, the dark errata chords which round out the passage suggest the Earth Mother is still at work on both Alberich and Wotan for her own mysterious purposes. The as yet undisclosed import of her chords mixed with reverse melody notes, themselves potently charged with racial impetus, suggests she still has cards up her sleeve, and the dwarf's racial hopes remain a part of them. Out of this unsettling fog, at mäßig bewegt, giant syntax enters the tone poem. Sabor is content to settle on this as reminding Wotan of his approaching clash with the Titans, then says no more of the detailed syntax crowding the interlude's following measures, a full third of its overall length. Like its predecessor, this transition, another that Darcy notes, is better viewed as a quasi-cinematic crosscut. Scene 2-3 has only one of these, in which the god's descent shifts to a look at Alberich's tyranny over Nibelheim. Scene 3-4 employs two such crosscuts, and this, the first of them, shifts focus entirely to the giants. Unlike Wotan, who can only feel his triumph is complete, Fasolt and Fafnir remain locked in an unresolved dispute. Both are determined to get their own back on the gods, yet Scene 2 leaves no doubt each sees that comeuppance in a very different way. Fafnir is glad to trade Freya for the Nibelung gold, but Fasolt still longs for the goddess as a love object. It's reasonable, never mind more dramatically apt, to suppose this portion of the interlude depicts something more than simply tramping up to Valhalla. Instead, the brothers wrangle over their opposing agendas, a dispute Fafnir has won by the time Scene 4 begins. The first Loge Erda sequence presents the giant's arguments and its rebuttal, with Loge and through him Erda as mediator. Fasolt's position is that holding Freya robs the gods of immortality. Gently but firmly, Loge counters him to suggest his aspiration is identical to Alberich's hubris, finally invoking Erda's fateful powers to let Fasolt know the dwarf still opposes the giants along with the gods, a revelation the fire sprite crowns with a tantalizing hint of a new element destined to enter the equation. As with all the work's syntactic material so detailed it requires immediate reinforcement, this first episode repeats in its entirety. Fasolt responds with another pair of syntactic bundles, the primal giant thump powerfully mixed with Erda chord notes in their Nibelung servitude context, his position that accepting the horde enslaves the giants just as it does the Nibelung. Repeated giant turns, coupled with the rising Erda melody notes, present Fasolt's impassioned but ultimately futile appeal against Erda's decree that he must sacrifice his hopes of mating, thus inevitably breeding with Freya. Adding weight to this construction, the hesitation in the initial pair of giant turns looks back to Fasolt's fond appreciation of the goddess in Scene 2. Loge re-enters the conversation, this time in earnest, his scale rushing up to preface the interlude's most cryptic passage. As noted, it's a gentle, even reassuring contrast to all that's come before, as if the fire god means to calm the miserable Titan with an idea that may reconcile him to Freya's loss. Unlike the previous two, this tight bundle repeats only in the sense its two final measures develop its initial two, a signal the conundrum it poses is meant to remain dark until clarified by future events. Thanks to the first apple notes juxtaposed with their version in Fafnir's delight at the god's death by old age, what can be gleaned at this point is that Loge suggests that giants may bring the immortals low without denying them Freya, even achieve a kind of immortality without the apples, one independent of the demonstrably vulnerable magic fruit. Beneath these apple variants, Loge's distinctively altered viola modules in the initial measures alternate during its last two measures with their utterly new variant, itself an evolution of its earlier ascent, where Erda first exerts her resistance to Fasolt's determination in keeping Freya. Even after this minute examination of the passage, with its answers to Fasolt's longing for the goddess of love, its full import must remain a largely unsolved riddle until clarified by the drama's events. What's evident from the immediately following crescendo on apples, one brimming with genuine heartache, is that a grieving Fasolt at last accepts he must lose Freya. Sabor opines the apple passage sends another appeal to Wotan's conscience. But this runs counter to the work's narrative logic. Now that Wotan has Alberich's ring, he means to keep it, along with Freya. He He doesn't know the giants will demand it as the final piece of the goddess's ransom, and even then it's only Erida's warning which convinces him to relinquish it, something he does without any consideration for the love goddess. The remaining syntactic mysteries in the interlude's central passage must wait to unravel when the developing epic gradually redeems their cryptic hints. The simplest explanation at this point is that Erda through Loge decrees Fasolt must trade Freya for golden ring, while promising his sacrifice will ultimately benefit his descendants. The interlude's remainder is less obscure, but still raises heretofore unanswered questions. The apple's development climaxes with its last heartrending apple's pulse by a cell remarkably similar to Twilight in its Götterdämmerung form. This might be construed, as Sabor does, as a reference to Wotan's thoughts, but the god is still to be confronted by Erda's prediction of that event, making Sabor's an unlikely explanation. Loge, by contrast, needs no such encounter to know the immortal's end approaches, and he throws that bone to the sorrowing Fasolt. The grounding in Erda chords developed quite lightheartedly across 14 subsequent rising iterations seems to promise the sorrowing giant the Earth Mother favors him and will redeem his sacrifice. The following 6 measures of Loge's syntax merrily scampers down through strings into added bassoons as it attests to the fire sprite's pleasure in overcoming Fasolt's objections. The interlude's second and final crosscut occurs with the appearance of Loge's buzzing trill for 2 measures, as if to depict the mountaintop smoking sulphur cleft from which the gods emerge with Alberich and fetters as low woodwinds and strings rush up Loge's chromatic scale. Much as it does as the interlude begins, this scale terminates in 6 pulses of the dwarf's capture, this time with each of their initial notes punctuated by cruel marcato horn blasts, their chord notes harmonized by violas into the chords themselves, a detail reinforced by a final trio of chord notes whose sinking harmonies are cut short by a sting and opposing demi-semi-quaver string scales, themselves terminated with another sharp chord as if journey complete, the gods plop Alberich down on the mountaintop to launch scene 4. I suspect this gives the viewer much to process, who welcome a respite before wrestling the monumental Scene 4. Our next video picks up where this one leaves off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 217, with the beginning of Scene 4. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond.